It's February 21st, 1947, and the first proxy battle of the Cold War is in full swing.
From Europe's forgotten front, an exclusive Pathé report. In mountainous Pindus country on the Greek-Albanian border, we spotlight the war which has raged unchecked since the rest of Europe went back to peace.
On the other side of the world, Dean Acheson, Truman's Secretary of State, is waiting for a letter to arrive from the British embassy. He thinks he knows what it says.
From the successful engagement, a column of prisoners is marched back to Janina. Their escorts, though wearing British pattern battle dress...
The UK had been funneling aid and troops into Greece, but the British had their own money problems, which the letter politely explained. England was out, and this war, it was officially America's problem.
I have the distinguished honor of presenting to you the President of the United States.
2 weeks later, Harry Truman found himself at a podium before a joint session of Congress.
I believe that our help should be primarily through economic and financial aid, which is essential to economic stability and orderly political processes.
The administration told lawmakers that if Greece's monarchy fell, communism might start spreading further. But for the low price of $400 million, they could keep the Soviets from testing that theory out.
The seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and want.
Truman was trying to tell the U.S. a story about itself, that as the leader of the West, fighting the Soviets wasn't just a strategy.
They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died.
It was our moral identity.
We must keep that hope alive.
2 months later, lawmakers greenlit the request. It was Congress's first major aid package of the Cold War. But by the fall of the USSR, the U.S. had become the biggest arms dealer in the world, to a far riskier portfolio of clients.
You see the King of Saudi Arabia and you see President Trump sitting down there.
The U.S. signs a defense pact with India, boosting Delhi's access to sophisticated military hardware.
And more on that Israel-U.S. dynamic. Knesset members have approved a $15 billion arms deal with the United States.
It's a trend that Congress has passively greenlit for years, often to devastating harm. So, in this episode, we're diving into the world of arms transfers. The how, the why, and everything that can go wrong. I'm Lacey Healy, and today we're diving into the world of, well, things that go...
Experiencing the news each day can feel like a journey. With Up First from NPR, it doesn't have to be. Welcome to 15 easy minutes of breaking news, clarity on international and national affairs, all handed over not from some floating voice in the sky, from us, Layla, A, Steve, and me, Rachel. Start your day informed. Subscribe to Up First wherever you get your podcasts.
It's hard to overstate just how much weapons factor into our foreign policy. And yet, I don't know about you, but even for a budget nerd like me, sometimes the process of how we buy, sell, and even give arms can still feel like kind of a mystery. And let's be honest, when it comes to scrutinizing the U.S. weapons industry, what have most Americans had to work with beyond, say, Tony Stark?
I have successfully privatized world peace. What more do you want?
Which, let's be honest, isn't that far off.
That's how Dad did it. That's how America does it. And it's worked out pretty well so far.
Lauren Woods spends a lot of time thinking about America's love affair with weapons, running the Center for International Policy's Security Assistance Monitor.
It used to be that U.S. involvement meant troops in a country. And I think that's largely how we still think of it. And if we don't have boots on the ground, we think, well, we're not doing very much. And of course, you and I know that the United States has a range of tools for getting involved, many of which have no boots on the ground, and many of which are entirely arms sales and training and all these ways we exercise the military around the world, but it looks like we're not.
Can you help me understand, if I am a regular listener or even a person like me with a passing sort of understanding, the difference between arms trade and aid and how the U.S. uses those and historically has used those in foreign policy?
So what we use as the umbrella term for everything is security cooperation, and that encompasses all forms of the United States interacting and cooperating with security forces around the world.
When it comes to weapons, this plays out in two ways.
So some countries will use their money and purchase arms.
Think Israel or Saudi Arabia. This is an arms sale. And then we have security assistance, aka Congress gives our money to other countries, which they then spend on their militaries and police, including on weapons. Congress can also just send weapons directly.
Either way, it's a safe bet that the arms manufacturers always win.
And between the nearly 150 countries we're partners with, the receipts add up quick.
We did a report on security assistance last year that coincided with the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and we looked at security assistance through that 20-year period. So that was $406 billion in security assistance programs around the world over 20 years. You get to numbers that big, and it's almost meaninglessly staggering, but it's a huge amount of money.
That number includes money for giving weapons, aid, training, and other support to partner countries. When it comes to arms sales, remember, that's when a country buys equipment from us with its own money, a pure business deal. In just 2021, Lauren says the U.S. earmarked around $36 billion worth of weapons to other countries. And if you can believe it, there's money missing from these numbers. Most smaller weapons packages, things like guns, they miss the $14 million reporting threshold. In other words, the government doesn't even have to tell the public or Congress that they're happening.
Sometimes they're consulted in advance. Sometimes they find out through a notification that's officially provided. It's important to note that they have the ability to weigh in on a weapons sale up to the point of the delivery. So any point in that process, they can come in and they can cancel it.
Okay, so if I'm a lawmaker and I've got an issue with a proposed transfer, what are my options?
Well, you can pass legislation to prevent an arms transfer. Congress tried to do that in 2019 with a Saudi sale. They can call for hearings. They can get people to testify and raise public awareness and draw attention to certain issues. And they can also informally pressure the administration to take their concerns more seriously.
You'll also see lawmakers use what's called a hold. For any major arms deal, the administration tends to informally and privately give Congress an overview of what's included. It's a chance for lawmakers to weigh in before anything goes public. And if there's any issue, they can place a hold on the deal. It's how many deals get derailed. But here's the important part. This process is actually just more of a long-standing handshake agreement. Holds don't force the administration to stop the sale. Only one thing can do that, a bill. So let's talk about that 2019 deal that Lauren mentioned. Criticism of America's deals with Saudi Arabia had been building for years. The country was brutally attacking Yemeni civilians in its proxy war against the Iran-backed Houthi rebels.
I think to myself, is there ever anything important that can happen in Washington? Is there ever anything I can do to save some of the millions of children that are dying in Yemen? This is it. This is this debate today. It isn't about an arms sale. It's about children like Ali who died.
A few months before Kentucky Senator Rand Paul made this speech, just 27 senators were on board to oppose a potential $1.5 billion sale to Saudi Arabia. After the speech, that number rose to 47. Still not enough to actually sink anything. But then, a year later...
Well, the U.S. is calling for a transparent investigation of the disappearance of a Saudi journalist who'd been critical of Saudi Arabia's crown prince.
In his strongest remarks to date, President Trump said it appears missing Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi is dead.
Tonight, Turkish forensic experts searching for hours at the home of a Saudi diplomat.
Around that time, America was teeing up roughly $8 billion more in weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, part of a larger uptick in U.S. deals under President Trump, who was not looking to break that streak.
They're spending $110 billion purchasing military equipment and other things. If we don't sell it to them, they'll say, well, thank you very much, we'll buy it from Russia, or thank you very much, we'll buy it from China. That doesn't help us, not when it comes to jobs and not when it comes to our companies losing out on that work. But there are other things we can do.
Not a hit on Capitol Hill. Here's Rand Paul again.
When you have direct evidence and when our own intelligence community has concluded that there is high confidence that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia butchered a dissident with a bone saw in a consulate in a foreign country, you would think that would give us pause as to giving Saudi Arabia or selling Saudi Arabia more weapons.
In response, Congress passed exactly 22 resolutions of disapproval, which Trump successfully vetoed, despite pleas for an override. Senator Bob Menendez.
We cannot brand the sale of precision-guided munitions as humanitarian weapons if the Saudis are intentionally targeting civilians in the first place.
But it wasn't exactly surprising when the measures failed.
On this vote, the yeas are 45, the nays are 40.
Throughout history, there have been plenty of times when Congress has waived the threat of legislation to kill an arms sale or used delay tactics like holds to sabotage relations with a country. But Congress has never successfully stopped an arms sale by passing legislation.
The bill on reconsideration fails to pass over the veto of the President of the United States.
And no matter how you explain that fact, you'll end up at the same reality. With every transfer, America has risked unintended consequences. After the break, we ask, what has all this spending and selling really earned us? When Jody Vittori was in high school, she knew exactly where she wanted to go. Outer space.
Take forward. 10 and 50 feet down at 4.
She'd flipped through college catalogs, combing through her options.
And when I looked up where you studied aeronautics and astronautics, the main places were the Air Force Academy and Naval Academy. So coming from a military family, I duly applied and somehow got accepted.
But once she actually started studying astronautics, there was one problem.
I was really bad at it.
And with that, her career floated back down to earth and into intelligence.
As my professors would tell you, your tax money was much better spent that way.
These days, Jody teaches at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. But before that, she spent 20 years in the Air Force, which took her across the world.
Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Afghanistan, South Korea, and then throughout the United States.
And a deployment to the Balkans during the Yugoslav wars, where she noticed a problem her schooling hadn't covered.
We're watching the role of all of these organized crime groups / militia groups along ethnic lines and how they were affecting, how they had an incentive to not have peace in the Balkans. That they were making a lot of money off the war, they were stealing a lot of foreign aid. They would claim that their troops weren't getting any money to get paid when, you'd see the militia leader suddenly having a new Mercedes-Benz.
That was the 90s. In the following decades, Congress would grow more and more willing to greenlight weapons aid and trade for similarly unstable places.
So one of the things that has not been appreciated oftentimes is that overall worldwide, the defense sector is one of the most famous sectors for corruption.
It's a cycle that plays out in any number of ways, sometimes fueling longer conflicts or even new ones.
When we do arms exports to authoritarian regimes that are our allies, we're reinforcing their ability to both basically bribe their security leaders with patronage and these side contracts and all this to keep them loyal to the authoritarian government. And we're giving them the means to do so, especially when we sell things like small arms and stuff. And that's the kind of environments that created the conditions for things like the Arab Spring to begin with.
Siphoning funds, missing weapons. Countries generally preferred not to report these problems. You can imagine why.
There are certain things that you can't just be blabbing to the world. But unfortunately, that ability to have national security secrets can be abused, not only in the United States, but particularly in other countries. And then you have defense budgets that are really large, and oftentimes defense expenditures that are off budget. So you have legally allowed incredible levels of secrecy combined with very large amounts of money, and what could go wrong?
In Afghanistan, Jody had a front seat to all of the answers, while serving on a NATO anti-corruption task force, which, among many goals, was trying to stop U.S. weapons ending up on the black market.
And ending up in the hands of the Taliban and so forth. The stuff that literally, quote-unquote, fell off the back of the truck and was showing up in Bush Bazaar in Kabul and all these other places.
That's Bush as in George W., where one could buy stolen NATO craft cheese, tanning oil, and military equipment. And as in so many stories of war, civilians in Afghanistan paid the highest price for the dysfunction.
There's incredible military people and special forces people and stuff in Afghanistan. They were just incredible, and they were given their heart and often their lives to trying to reform Afghanistan. But we had set up a system that so stacked the deck against them that, we put our thumb on the scales that made it so hard for good local people to do good things to reform their government and make their government the way they wanted it to. If you were a good officer, but you weren't going to pay bribes for promotion, it was very hard to get promoted. The whole system was just so corrupt that you weren't going to get your logistics. Some of the worst corruption was actually happening in the Afghan military sector in their military hospitals, where you had to pay bribes to get treatment, you had to pay bribes to get food. That really undercuts the willingness of soldiers to lay themselves out on their line. So these were the sorts of issues we dealt with. Getting anti-corruption to be explicitly a line of effort in battle plans. Making considerations of corruption, national security, or trying to get them to be a line of effort in issues like borders and customs. Trying to work with the Afghan national security forces to make borders and customs a priority, making protecting economic areas a priority, and trying to encourage them to clean out their own security sector forces. But I often do make the point that when I came to Afghanistan in 2011, Afghanistan was considered the second most corrupt country, according to the Corruption Perceptions Index that Transparency International puts out. And when I left, it was the most corrupt country. So you can see how well I did. I failed miserably, so.
Let's make something clear, though. It's true that the U.S. spends and makes more than ever on weapons packages. But these scenarios, they're not new. Bad arms deals are actually how we got Congress's current regulations around trade. Among many, you can thank Richard Nixon.
Good evening, I'm Roger Mudd. Washington has been inundated by another massive set of Watergate transcripts.
Well, as part of this big investigation into Watergate and Vietnam and all this, first there'd been a lot of secret arms deals related to Vietnam that had tweaked interests, like why didn't Congress or the American people know about this? These are real security interests, real security risks, and our legislative branch didn't know about them, much less the American public, the voting public didn't know about them, which highlighted a lot of problems.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
But also as part of these church committee hearings, they're doing all of these hearings on these secret slush funds that companies had to bribe politicians. And those could be American politicians, but often they were foreign politicians as well.
U.S. weapons companies like Lockheed Martin were bribing countries around the world to buy their equipment, from Japan to Latin America. It was bad.
These have real strategic ramifications. The United States, at a time when there was a lot of legislation being made, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act gets made at this time.
Lawmakers also passed the Arms Export Control Act,
which is actually a pretty decent set of laws that you have to take into account things like human rights before you're allowed to sell arms. Can that country actually afford it? Does it make sense for this country to actually buy these arms? These are actually pretty good laws.
That was 45 years ago, and it's still one of the main laws regulating U.S. arms sales.
But it's also a problem because, A, we often don't implement those good laws or implement them very strongly.
And B, that tends to mean that other countries aren't as harsh with deals either.
And given how many massive loopholes there are in our laws, that's actually quite frightening.
And so what tools does Congress actually have to keep track of that stuff? Are they in the dark about a lot of it, really?
How they get delivered and who's checking has been a big controversy. This really came up with the Arab Spring in Yemen in 2011, where the government suddenly fell. And we'd been giving all this aid to Yemen, and people started asking, well, where are all the American-made weapons? And it turned out the United States didn't really know.
What Jody's talking about here is called end-use monitoring, which essentially amounts to checking if weapons Congress greenlit with taxpayer money that they budgeted are moving as intended. Jody remembers an office in Afghanistan which oversaw shipments coming from the U.S., where she says that system didn't always work as intended.
People have this image of the weapons show up and someone's taking stock numbers or something, and someone's with a clipboard and they're checking it off, which is what happens in American armories. But first off, most shipments never get checked, and that office doesn't have a lot of people do the checking. They have the embassy do it, but the embassy's got other things to be doing all day than going around checking weapons. So, when there's an exercise or something, they'll do some spot checks or something, but there's not a really robust, coordinated way to look at this.
Which, when it comes to government sales, is supposed to be the State Department's job, theoretically.
It's been very famous of how underfunded the State Department is. There's General Mattis's famous quote of something to the effect, I'm going to paraphrase him, if you keep cutting the State Department budget, I'm going to need more bullets. When the Secretary of Defense at the time is making these arguments, that's how far down cut everything is, and that means that things like these checks are also going to be cut. Even when we're supposed to be able to check and governments don't let us check, like Egypt at times and such, there aren't really ramifications when they don't let us check. Or like in Afghanistan, guys actually tried to go rip open some of the boxes, and the warehouses and stuff were just a disaster. And that ultimately goes back to Congress, because Congress is the one that makes the budget for State Department and, could stand on State Department and say, you are going to fund this appropriately and report back to us, and you're going to be much more visible in these things. And some of this is executive branch. The conventional arms trade policies come from the executive branch. But the funding and everything to do everything and the overall legislation comes from the legislative branch. So there's plenty of blame to go around.
But if you ask Lauren Woods, taking responsibility only goes so far.
In many ways, Congress has been a little bit MIA on some of these issues, unfortunately. I think it would be great to have them more involved, particularly when it comes to assessing risks and thinking about, should we even be involved in the first place? Should we be sending these weapons? I would love to see more involvement. In general, I just think there hasn't been the appetite.
Is there a bigger problem, too, that people are coming to the job without so much foreign policy understanding, and that this is a particularly maybe hard subject to understand? Do you think that plays into it at all?
There's been a lot of discussion about, members of Congress really struggling to get senior staff on. The committees have a lot of really good staff, but they are only so many people covering huge swaths of the world. And the personal staff are very much focused on constituent concerns, most of which have nothing to do with arms sales. So I think to some extent, everybody's stretched a little thin, but that shouldn't be an excuse. They have the Congressional Research Service. They have experts who would love to provide more background, but in part, if I'm going to be sympathetic, it might also be a bandwidth issue. I would also add that there's a disincentive to take arms sales seriously in many cases, because there are many states, particularly defense-heavy states like Virginia and others, where that industrial base really cares. Actually, contrary to limiting sales, many members of Congress are getting in there when the National Defense Authorization Act comes around and saying, please protect these industries. Please make sure that these actually go forward.
Which brings us to Congress's favorite justification for letting risky sales slide.
You want a job, Rennie? Sure, Tony. Okay, then you call me tomorrow.
The jobs argument has been one of the strongest arguments that has kept the support in Congress, and major arms companies know this.
We've actually talked about the most famous example of this, the F-35, on the show before.
When I was in the Air Force, I would see them pitching these sorts of, how many jobs in different constituencies and stuff like that. And often with the help of senior military officers who really wanted these weapons would help them make those pitches.
Evidence repeatedly shows that these estimates are overblown.
And also just there's cheaper ways to actually make jobs for one's constituency. Studies have shown that investing in healthcare, $1 million will create a lot more jobs in healthcare. It'll create a lot more jobs in education than it will in the defense sector.
And speaking of wasted money, it's also worth asking if certain weapons transfers even make diplomatic sense. Again, Lauren Woods.
One of the larger problems with U.S. security assistance is that, our diplomatic and our defense voices are often really not aligned, unfortunately. And so I think one of the underlying problems of security assistance is that it's trying to address short-term problems through weapons, to solve problems that can't be solved through weapons. And in effect, our defense actions are getting in the way of our diplomacy. So the State Department, I think, should be determining what are our interests, what values do we share with other countries, what should we accomplish. The problem comes when the Defense Department takes a bigger and bigger piece of that pie in decision making, and instead of focusing just on defense issues, are then reshaping our entire relationship with a country. So instead of furthering peace and security as the State Department is meant to do, then we are primarily providing weapons at such a pace and such a cost and rate that we are defeating our diplomatic goals.
Are there ways that Congress can influence the coming together there of a definition, of working together better? Are there laws that can be passed that can force that issue?
Yes. In fact, it's a great question because in 2017, under the National Defense Authorization Act that year, Congress actually passed legislation to say, in congressional language, you guys need to get better coordinating with each other on security assistance. And so since then, there have been attempts to really speak more with each other. We've heard anecdotally that the Defense Department is actually, picking up the phone and talking more to the State Department on those issues. So that's a good thing, but it takes really years for that to change, and they're still working on it.
And these days, Congress has more pressing decisions to make on weapons spending than ever.
The American people are answering President Zelensky's call for more help, more weapons for Ukraine to defend itself, more tools to fight Russian aggression. It's about freedom. It's about the right of people to determine their own future.
Hearing this, it's hard not to think of President Truman standing in front of Congress. But unlike Greece in 1947, Ukraine's military is fighting an invasion. It's the first major test of a years-long process to root out military corruption. Here's Jody.
They do have lots of organized crime groups. Their arms exports have had high degrees of corruption before. They've had senior leaders who've reportedly sold off the best equipment and armed their own troops with the less good equipment.
But instead of simply sending more weapons, the U.S., along with other Western countries, tried a different strategy.
In Afghanistan, famously, lots of Special Inspector General reports, we gave an awful lot of money and arms, and probably most importantly, impunity, to some really terrible actors. One of the things that I think will need lots of study is that, to a large extent, not a complete extent, but to a large extent, the opposite happened in Ukraine. So instead of giving lots of money and arms and the impunity that went with it, it was so much more about how do we set up good military institutions, how do we marginalize bad actors. Boring but important things like trying to get a decent audit of their major arms exporter, and how do you set up a proper NCO corps, and how do you set up a proper medical corps.
Lauren actually used to oversee similar trainings while working at the State Department. They make up just a sliver of U.S. security assistance, but she remembers some participants wanting more organizational and human rights skills to use, like what Ukraine got.
And what that said to me was that in a lot of cases, not every time, but in a lot of cases, the political will among the personnel is there. People genuinely want to do better a lot of the time, but what's being provided to them may be too technical, or maybe too militaristic, or maybe too focused on other short-term goals at the expense of better ways of engaging with people for the long term.
And while it's still far too early to call the outcome of Ukraine's defense and U.S. investment, Lauren says that the best time to take responsibility for our desired outcome is before any weapons leave the dock.
I think that, kind of the basics 101 best lessons learned for security assistance and arms sales always apply, and we're tempted to overlook them because every case seems new and different, and then we find that they never are. So even though Ukraine is an ally and needs to defend itself, it is still prudent to consider all the risks involved based on much of our history of providing weapons around the world. So one thing we know from experience and many lessons learned in many places is weapons never go away. If it's still usable, it is going to outlive the conflict. It's going to end up in someone's hands. And so what is the way that we're going to account for that and think about the life cycle of these weapons long after, hopefully, this is all over?
This episode was produced by Christina Stella and me, and edited by Nikki Galtland and Katie Toth. Our music for the show is written by Darian Schulman, and Robin Wise makes each episode sound its very best, as always. Thanks to the supporters and foundations that make our work possible. The Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Coulomb Foundation, Craig Newmark Foundation, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. If you're listening and you like what we do, we'd love to hear from you. Go ahead and leave us a review, and come visit us anytime on social at Inkstick Media. We'll see you right back here in 2 weeks.
Eating cereal right next to me in my kitchen.
I was going to say, if you need to yell at the 13-year-old, you can yell at the 13-year-old and we can cut that out.
The 13-year-old took the cereal box, the carton of milk, and the bowl to his room. Apparently, he was hungry while playing Risk. Let me know if you need me to redo that part.
Perfect.
From PRX.